The hard fact in archaeology is that most of us don't have the talent to find a site like Göbekli Tepe, let alone excavate it properly and interpret it. Most of us dig on sites like this site in Sicily, where I excavated my most recent project, which was a very, very ordinary ancient village, which was the whole reason why we went there. Because more than 100 years of field work now on ordinary kinds of sites, as well as the really spectacular ones around the world, have produced a wealth of archaeological evidence. Literally billions of artifacts have accumulated. Museum storerooms all over the world are just bulging with stuff. And not only do we have billions of objects to work with, we've also had a real revolution in the kind of techniques available to us, new natural science techniques that change the whole way we can look at this evidence. I mean, over here, the sort of space alien stuff you see on the left, this is ancient pollen remains, hugely magnified, important source of evidence about diet. Here you see the extraction of ice cores from Antarctica, major source of evidence for ancient climate change. The new scientific techniques combined with the billions of artifacts now available, and then we feed them back into the more traditional sorts of literary evidence. And here we've got a papyrus of the beginning of the New Testament book of Matthew. Put all these pieces of evidence together. Collectively, they make an incredible source which has begun to transform the way we think about the fall of civilizations. Even the fall of kind of the mother of all falls of civilizations, the collapse of ancient Rome. Seen here a couple of absolutely magnificent paintings from the 1830s. This was Destruction and Desolation by an American artist named Thomas Cole. You know, people have been thinking about the fall of Rome for centuries and centuries. There was a German book published 30 years ago which listed more than 200 theories that have been put forward for why the Roman Empire fell. And in the last 30 years, we've accumulated so much evidence that we've now got to the point that instead of just adding more theories, we're actually able to start winnowing down the number of theories, getting down a little bit from the 200. And the sort of things that we are now beginning to put together about the fall of ancient Rome, one of them is driven by new techniques of excavation. This is a reconstruction of a post-Roman village in England, dating to the 7th and 8th centuries. When I started in this field in the 1970s, one of my first digs was on a post-Roman site. And back in those days, we would have been really lucky to have known how to recover the traces of buildings like this. Now we have enormous amounts of evidence from these settlements, and we're beginning to realize things like the old theories about the barbarian invasions of Rome. The numbers of people involved were much, much smaller than we'd thought. Over here on the right, I was seeing an ancient DNA lab, which is one of the main ways we've been able to figure out. The numbers of people involved, much smaller. The movements of populations, much, much slower than we'd previously thought. From evidence like tree rings, we now understand the role of climate was much bigger in the collapse of the Roman Empire than anyone had ever guessed. So too the role of disease. Here we've got a plague pit excavation going on in France. Many new sources of evidence beginning to change our picture of how the Roman Empire fell. And also, we're able to put together a new understanding of the fall of the Roman Empire with similar sorts of evidence from more and more ancient collapses around the world. And on this slide, we've just got a 2,000-year span across halfway around the planet of the collapse of other ancient civilizations. Here we've got Knossos on Crete. There's a great collapse in the East Mediterranean around 1200 BC. And over here, about 2,000 years later, the Maya site of Tikal. With this huge comparison set now to compare all the different ancient collapses and ask ourselves whether we can begin to draw out some general theories about how civilizations collapse. And actually we can go all the way back to about 2200 BC with this sort of analysis now. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire in what's now Iraq. And it's a site called Tel Leilan, which is, you see right up at the top on the map here, where in addition to the usual sorts of things like great palace remains were dug up there, also this was the first site in Iraq where the study of ancient soil sediments began to show that the collapse of this Akkadian Empire around 2200 BC seems to be driven very, very heavily by climate change. We've got a number of recurring features beginning to emerge. And in fact, in my own thinking about this problem, the collapse of civilizations, it seems to me that in every major collapse, we have basically 5 factors that almost always crop up. I like to call them the 5 horsemen of the apocalypse. They show up again and again. The first of them is major uncontrollable population movements, which kind of overwhelm what the societies of the day are able to deal with. Following on from that, and often driven by it, is the rise of major new epidemic diseases, often created by disease pools which had been separate, now being merged by the population movements. Coming along with the population movements, epidemic diseases, we also tend to get the collapse